Welcome to all of you, my colleagues. Happy to have you all here today, and I hope that you and yours are continuing to find some peace and health through these strange days. So, as of now, we've spent months doing our due diligence in ethically and responsibly continuing our clinical activities. The art and science of assessment has always carried with it considerable challenges, and there have been many sources, inclusive of Pearson's webcast series, that have provided strategies and guidelines for teleassessment. I'm going to speak only briefly to these points today. The primary focus of this webinar is going to be on maximizing impact to your assessment work in a time where the tangible reflection provided by our assessment tools may offer something very unique and clearly applicable to your client's current needs. I'm speaking to the ability to use the information from personality assessments to hone in on and align with your client's sense of themselves and what allows them to make sense of their world in more normal times. As you may know, and my own work is deeply aligned with a Millon evolutionary theory perspective, and that is what I'll be emphasizing. I encourage you, though, to explore this theme and perspective not only with the Millon instruments, but also with the MMPI or other objective personality instruments you may be comfortable using, and along with performance-based and cognitive assessments as well. All of these have some ability to capture aspects of a person's usual functioning and offer comparative note to what someone might experience in less stable times. So then, let's get into it. So remember when we thought, well, the kids will be back in school within a few weeks, I can go get a haircut again soon, I can hug my extended family members and my friends, and I'll really appreciate that. And most importantly, I won't be fretting losing yet another person from my life. And then the pandemic went on, and it continues, with perhaps some cautious optimism of perhaps sometime next year we'll be looking at something that might resemble normal. You know, there's still so many unknowns. Like our clientele, we're human. We have some expectations of what's a normal expectation in life, and when there's not that normal expectation there, and when we don't really have a clear idea as to when it might return. And for some things, it's not when, it's if. Now, going specific to assessment psychologists, we have kind of a unique perspective as well. Like all cultures, we have our traditions. Those traditions are rooted in what's kept us safe, what's kept us accurate, and what's kept us useful to the people we serve. And although there are those of us, myself somewhat included, who sometimes like to stretch but not necessarily break barriers and boundaries, you could really describe our methods as fairly traditional. Now that perspective and that zeitgeist, that way that we approach our work really keeps us grounded. It provides reference points that are universally understood, and it forms a consistent means of striving for equity and pragmatism. It also leads to some limitations, not only in less unusual times, but particularly when we're compelled to modify things. Adding to this is the challenge that the need for assessment and intervention didn't stop back in March. In fact, it increased significantly, and it isn't nearly done growing. While we're doing quite well in figuring out these new methodologies, have we really thought through how vital our clinical alliance is in this new circumstance? That's really what I'm after in today's talk. Adapting some of those methodologies I've developed for the Millon inventories, along with other influences I'll share, I'm hoping there might be a few aspirational notes to come out of this hour that might assist you in helping your clients identify means of regaining their grounding. So before we get into the substance of what I'm talking about, I'd like to provide and perhaps just reiterate a few fundamental foundational elements. And I won't take your time or attention by reading this or going over it in any real detail, other than to point out the intent. So what you see here is the basic statement that Pearson has published for telepractice. As you might expect, and as is appropriate, there are general guidelines that are much in the spirit of the APA ethics codes, combined with some legal reminders. I would take a bit of time with the downloaded slide materials to review this paragraph both for the spirit and the letter of the law, maybe just for a refresher for some of you at this point, because you've been doing this for some time, and that is if you already have not done so. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a issue moving the slide. Okay. So, in addition, I'm just sharing 2 other resources among many that have been published that speak to methodological considerations. The first is an excellent overview of considerations relevant to teleassessment, and the second details some requirements by state, speaking to overall clinical guidelines. Check in on the second with some regularity, as things do have a tendency to change every so often. A major point that was brought out by Jordan Wright, the lead author of the first source in one of his webinars on the subject, really framed our zeitgeist quite well. He invoked the quote, "Perfect is the enemy of good," an aphorism that's commonly attributed to Voltaire. And indeed, this is the sweet spot. We're not going to be able to match our usual standards, but that doesn't give us license to abandon them entirely. Through much of today's discussion, you'll hear the repetitive theme of do the best that you can. Sound complicated? Maybe scary? Why even consider trying to do what we do in other times if there's so much of our traditional mindset and process disrupted? Well, there's a likely host of reasons, not the most of, or least of which is that it speaks to our livelihood, particularly for those practitioners whose main focus is assessment. If we're being honest with ourselves and our duty for self-care, we have to acknowledge that our sense of normalcy is also disrupted, and we're feeling the effects. This may not be your first and foremost concern, but even if you're of the mindset to push assessment activity aside during these times, please acknowledge that disrupted sense of normalcy. That's going to be important as we cover the substantive suggestions for this environment. Now, speaking to continued needs, most obviously, there are some assessment needs that are high stakes and time sensitive, and timeliness outweighs deferment. Those cases are our priority work while we're going through this, but I want you to think a bit more extensively as well to projected mental health needs. Right now, we are seeing distress and fatigue levels rise, and we aren't even close to understanding the ubiquitous grief over the loss of normalcy or manifest or latent anxiety emanating from the unpredictable future. Therapists now are trying to provide some normalizing context, and that therapeutic relationship can go a long way on its own. But that brings up the question then, what can we as assessment psychologists add to help clients through a necessary survival mode toward igniting resilience, helping formulate a compassionate self-narrative, and restoring a sense of normalcy? As we start to look at some of the more substantive suggestions in this webinar, I do want to point out the perspective I'm taking and how it differs from our usual and customary ways of doing things. At this point, we still don't have a history to guide us on what's happening right now. There's no evidence base in the way that we usually think of that phrase. In fact, we're actively creating the evidence base, or as the adage goes, we're building the plane as we fly it. The last time we faced a global pandemic, I probably don't have to remind you at this point, there was no psychological testing as we now know it. We had just seen the very first American Stanford Binet, as well as some primitive self-reports, but even the Rorschach was several years into the future at that point, and the MMPI was still a couple of decades away. So in order to have this informed approach, we need to do a little borrowing from related areas in which we do have an evidence base. Looking at the sampling I've listed here, you could make a well-reasoned argument about how each could be related to current presentations. Borrowing from these does not mean we bring in procedures and treatment plans verbatim, but rather we use these as they pertain to individual presentation and apply these in more an aspirational manner, following the evidence-based protocols and procedures to the extent possible. With that in mind, I'd like to just briefly review a small sampling of influences I consulted when I was thinking through not only the procedural challenges continuing to assess via teleassessment in this environment, but more germane to these sources, what I wanted to be able to accomplish by virtue of assessment in these times. Each bears a perspective that I felt was important and a part of the voice that I want to share with people as they search for ways to center and normalize. Some are directly relevant to the notion of psychology and assessment. Others speak to the potential for surmounting obstacles and growing. So let's take a look at what each has to offer. I want to start by highlighting a paper that came out early on in my doctoral training so many years ago, and it's reverberated with me for years, influencing my perspective on personality disorder throughout my career, and perhaps making a case to be brought out again. I want to point out that I'm not necessarily for or against the entirety of methodology this article represented. What I do want to extract and put into our equation for this discussion is something that really struck me as a novel notion, best articulated by answering this question. The question being, what really is a personality disorder? While that question may have many nuances to its answer, I would argue that a workable answer to that query might be this. It's the systematic afunctional attempt of an individual to manage their life and its challenges. Note that I didn't use the term dysfunctional, but rather afunctional, to reflect a person's attempt at normalcy. Now, prior to quarantine, prior to conditions that we're in, folks who may fit this description were functioning, albeit in ways atypical to what we consider to be adaptive. It's possible in that helping a person ground themselves to be able to manage through unusually difficult times, we may want to consider what's pre-morbid and even allow for steps that may seem backward to help the person regain a sense of equilibrium. If a classically defined dysfunctional quality is something that allows the person to make their way, that may be the topography we need to traverse before helping them move into something more adaptive. Now, coming in a little bit closer to the world of personality assessment in general, and personality-guided assessment and treatment in particular, I wanted to turn to some work done by our colleagues George Everly and Jeffrey Lading in the context of PTSD and the use of Millon-oriented assessment and intervention. These authors continue to this day to do exemplary work in human stress response and PTSD. But back in 2003, they authored one of the personality-guided therapy volumes, contextualizing the MCMI-III with treatment for PTSD. Those of you familiar with Millon's evolutionary model, which I'll say more on in just a little bit, will probably recognize the three-polarity motivational structure of personality. To this, Everly and Lading added the fourth polarity of intellective versus affective, which can easily be related to how a person is connected to their emotional world. The major contributor here, I feel, is the inclusion of the concept of explanatory worldview. In PTSD, they know this is the primary psychological process that gets disrupted. A person's ability to make sense of the world and allow for it, with all its itinerant threats, to simply exist in background most of the time while going about one's business, is so integral to allowing for life to continue, from freedom of fear of that doorknob you're about to grab, to the richness and meaning we get from our sense of self and our relationships. I choose these examples purposely because both extremes, up and down the parallel and familiar construct of Maslow's hierarchy, have to some degree been disrupted throughout the last 7 or 8 months. This model posits, and we borrow from it, the notion that an effective strategy to restoring this construct for normality is to understand a person's framework from those evolutionary concepts. Finally, I want to mention the contribution from the approach I've adopted for much of my assessment work and the way I think about contextualizing my feedback and treatment approaches across measures. The primary nod here goes to Steve Finn and the collaborative and therapeutic assessment community. This school of thought is a world of study unto its own, and I want to mark just a few highlights that inform what I'll apply to the Millon paradigm. Collaborative here means the assessor is the expert on the assessment material, but the person is the ultimate expert on themselves. That's what sets this model apart from the traditional assessment paradigm. That sets the stage for the core elements that we can integrate into all that I've already stated about relative normalcy and resilience. By humanizing this relationship in this way, you can best position yourself to use test data for empathy magnification. As the individual hears about what some of our psychological constructs mean, and the fact that they responded like those who exhibit some of those qualities, they are granted a framework to use this information to help instill a more compassionate self-narrative for adapting to current circumstances. There's also a true skill in identifying what information to share and when, and how to modify this for circumstances. Generally, Dr. Finn's model provides for 3 levels of client feedback information, which ranges from information that's relatively easy and consistent with current understanding of themselves. That's what he calls level 1. Through information that's a bit of a stretch but still very plausible to the individual, that's level 2. And then level 3, information that is novel and likely to be more difficult to integrate. Keep this in mind as we approach assessment materials with an eye to infusing a view on normalcy and an intent to identify and bolster resilience. And now, with all the foregoing in mind, and these sources providing an aspirational framework for looking at assessment results, I'm going to turn our attention over to personality assessment with the Millon inventories, and how borrowing from these sources, at least in spirit, might provide some perspective on our current challenges. Keep in mind again, this is very much aspirational, and we're maintaining our standards for administration and interpretation as close to our established protocols as we can. You may also have some sources and background you might wish to apply, whether from your training or your research or from your personal readings. What I've drawn from these sources is not always the core of their message, but often elements that help build this unusual lens necessary for work in this environment. So I'll be very briefly reviewing the building blocks of Millon's theory with particular emphasis on how some of these elements might be particularly relevant in uncertain times. For a fuller discourse on the subject, I would recommend any one of a number of our earlier introductory MCMI4 webinars that are available on the Pearson website. So moving into the theory. At the very basic level of the theory lies the system of motivating aims. Every personality scale or personality prototype is a configuration of these 3 evolutionary polarities, or how I like to refer to them in application, a person's basic motivational structure. Every configuration, then, of 2 or more highlighted Millon personality scales is a blending of the prototypes in much the same way as basic colors blend to create secondary and then more complex colors. Also, the degree to which a particular point may be problematic stems from a combination of how extreme or inflexible the quality might be, and whether there's interference, such as a conflict or a reversing of those polarities. I'm going to demonstrate that in upcoming examples. But very basically, the polarity structure consists of the 3 polarities: existence, adaptation, and replication. The usual definitions apply here, in addition to some consideration of current challenges. The first, existence, dynamically represented by an individual's tendency to either play it safe or to extend oneself for life enhancement, speaks clearly to an individual's survival mode, the kinds of tendencies they may show in regards to protecting self or foregoing prudent precaution. The second, adaptation, dynamically represented by acting on an environment to make that environment fit the individual's need versus conforming to the demands of environment, may well speak to the likelihood of overall conformity to current guidelines and restrictions. Finally, the replication polarity, that self-other nurturant dynamic, may hold important information about how a person expends their energy on the health and well-being or the over-involvement of either themselves, an independent strategy, or others, a dependent strategy. The 3 polarities, then, lend themselves to the personality spectra, as you see here. This can be looked at as an expanded variant of the... Does somebody have a question? I'm sorry. I think we had a breakthrough for a moment. Continuing, I'm sorry. These polarities lend themselves to the personality spectra you see in front of you. Now, this can be looked at as an expanded variant of the current DSM definitions, though not constrained by those diagnostic categories. This happens in two ways. First, what might not be entirely clear from the graphic, but what I'll speak to in more detail shortly, it's unusual for only one spectra to emerge in a given presentation. But this system allows for this by virtue of how the polarities mix. Second, and more apparent in this visual, is that there's really a range of functioning not contained to what we usually think of as a disordered personality. If you look across any one of the rows, you'll see a descriptor for gradations of functionality and how these tend to correspond to base rate elevations. While it takes more than a particular score or elevation to determine a level of functioning, as with any test, this assists in making determination of the relative level of difficulty a person may exhibit in their flexibility and adaptivity, particularly in a global crisis. It may be useful to point out a few basic examples on how current circumstances might modify things. Keep in mind I'm isolating patterns, and usually you won't be dealing with this simplistic of a profile, but rather add mixtures of more than one personality profile. So, for an example, a respondent with a rather highly elevated dependent pattern may have considerable difficulties in quarantine conditions, as they usually defer to others, resist initiatives, and depend on social supports that are now disrupted. On the other hand, these folks might truly benefit from pointing out the immediacy of the teleassessment platform they're currently using with you as perhaps an example of how they've taken some matters into their own hands, despite themselves, and how little of a stretch it might be to use those social video platforms to reestablish some of their lost connections. Another example, someone with a highly elevated scale 5 or narcissistic pattern may think of themselves as having matters well under control and may tend to deny any additional needs brought on by the circumstances that surround us all. You would also want to see about how well they've followed safety and health precautions for themselves as well as others, and probably check in on their social support regardless of their denial of need for this. Losing regular sources of admiration from others can be deleterious. While you don't want to encourage continuation of their exploiting others for their narcissistic supply, you do want to check in on how they are managing matters of self-esteem, which can be particularly vulnerable during times like this. So very briefly then, I just want to point out the next level down in the theory. What you see are the components across each spectra of what constitutes the domains of personality. That is, when we think of an avoidant prototype, for example, we can describe behavioral, cognitive, interpersonal, intrapsychic, and biophysical aspects of that pattern across 8 domains that are consistent across all the spectra and allow for comparison and determination in profiles as they generally appear with more than one elevation. If, for example, a person elevates as a 2B5, that is, a combination of melancholic and narcissistic patterns, you may be able to identify various domains as more of a 2B, more of a 5 in nature. The highlighted cells represent the Grossman facet scales, which are identified in both the MCMI4 as well as the MACI-II, though this set is for the MCMI specifically. The non-highlighted cells are those you might be able to identify with a particular person after parsing down which spectra are the focus. These descriptors are aligned with therapeutic schools of thought, and they may also be useful in identifying strengths and vulnerabilities that are relevant to the current conditions. Then drawing once more from the collaborative and therapeutic assessment community, I want to take a little different viewpoint on how to convey the meaning of scales. First off, remember that a scale elevation doesn't define a person, but rather reflects that a person has responded in a way that's consistent with others identified as possessing a certain quality. In that way, there's room to have the person hear some descriptors of a construct and allow for them to relate to that information in a manner that may be more organic to them. An example of this, to this day, I know the feeling I often get if I score an MMPI and I get a 6.4 or 4.6 result. That's eased, though, when I take the perspective I just described and translate that language from our rather harsh clinical descriptors of paranoid, psychopathic, deviant on the old MMPI into something that reflects the original concept but is relatable. The TA community members have developed kind of a set of reframed descriptions, and the 6-4 combination, as appropriate to presentation, can translate the 4 to represent the person's strength, their ability to take care of themselves without having to rely on others, and the 6 to a watchfulness or an ability to survive. When, for example, a person with an abuse history who's elevated a 4-6 hears a descriptor such as strong survivor, they have something much more relatable. Moving over to the MCMI, I'll relate a similar example. Some time back, I was conducting a collaborative assessment with a woman whose primary elevations were compulsive and masochistic. Describing these patterns as having a willingness to do what's expected, often to her own detriment, and being reinforced for self-denigration, was hardly a stretch for her. We call that level 1 in collaborative terms. But she also had a moderately high elevation on the sadistic scale, and that was probably beyond level 3, at least at first, highly foreign to how she viewed herself. In approaching that information, I built up to it by exploring with her what happens when she feels like she's actually hurting herself by being so driven to meet expectations. And she reported that what might be expected, plus that when she just can't deal, she turns people away by scaring them off with surliness and aggression. That was the opportunity to relate to this level 3 information of aggressiveness, represented by that scale, to something that she's done because she felt she needed it, and to let her take the lead in working toward moderating that tendency to use it more judiciously in her self-protection. One second, please. I'm sorry. So how you frame that information really does matter, now and always. So let's turn to this framework for interpretation with these unusually challenging times, which is just a slight modification from how I usually teach this material. So to start with, we want to examine a person's level of functioning, also taking into consideration the person's presentation, other sources of information, inclusive of other testing material if you have it. You then add to this the degree of pathology, both personality and syndromal, as reflected on an MCMI-IV or MACI or whatever instrument you might be using. Looking particularly at personality elevations, you want to get an idea of where their elevations fall in the range of style, type, or disorder. The next step is going to contribute to this part of the equation as well. You'll also use these levels to get an initial gauge of what level of information might be appropriate, as well as make some predictions as to what might constitute a pre-crisis normal. Next, you're going to be looking at the highest elevations together and see how they interplay. Usually this is going to be the top 2 or 3 of the most elevated personality scales. In addition to the level of functioning you glean from the first step, here you're going to be looking at whether the scales align or complement or conflict with one another in terms of their respective polarity structure. The example I'll use shortly will is going to demonstrate this point, but for now, just understand that where you have disbalance or discord, that's where you're likely to find areas of vulnerability for this individual. However, you'll also likely uncover potential directions for determining normalcy and finding resilience by rebalancing what's there. Continuing on, we now look at both the most particular dimensions found in the facets as well as a more immediate focus on symptomology. This serves to give a glimpse as to what is happening for the person in the here and now, in combination with their established manner of managing their challenges. It also allows us to make educated predictions as to what their viewpoint is in terms of future optimism or pessimism. Look to see what might be at least of apparent use to the person as they try to navigate their current circumstance, as well as what may have seemed to have helped them in more normal times. It's from here, with all of the foregoing, that we might be able to have the most efficient, and greatest impact. So, with this in mind, let's turn our attention to an MCMI-IV case. Now, this particular profile was produced by a man in his mid-50s who come to see me initially about 2 months before the COVID crisis began, so just about the beginning of the year, a little bit before that. And he came to see me for an unrelated reason. It was in response to the illness and then subsequently the passing of his younger brother from an unusual cancer presentation. He told me that he was a professional client, in quotes, and had been to many therapists throughout his life, owing to his tendency to spend most of his life alone, and his tendency to be very self-critical of his hesitancy to express himself because he was sure everyone thought he was weird and dumb. He reported feeling very unnerved by the lack of emotionality over the loss of his sibling, which he compared to the response of his other two siblings, whom he said they were just wrecked by this. Shouldn't I also be? Now, I found this man to be fairly eloquent and intuitive and generally easily relatable, though there were some odd speech patterns, none of which suggested direct speech pathology, but rather a slightly anxious, jumpy, and sometimes abrupt quality. He described a good but largely uninvolved relationship with his brother throughout his life, but he considered himself his closest ally growing up. That said, they only had really sporadic contact throughout adulthood, despite living in the same general vicinity. He'd never had a long-term relationship and described only very minor short-term involvements being the other guy in somebody else's relationship, though this had not happened, he told me, in well over a decade. While he presented as quite intellectualized and in control in response to his brother's death, he was largely focused in those early sessions on his own mortality and what it would mean if he were to suddenly die in the not-too-distant future, having, as he put it, really not accomplished anything or created anything of meaning in his life. Not much different with the approach of the COVID environment. The first two teletherapy sessions, he joked, though uneasily, that he felt this is actually better for a guy like me. But something was cracking, and he noted it as well. The next session, he expressed a tremendous amount of existential dread, and he was tearful throughout the session, vacillating between saying, "It feels good to get this out," and expressing a tremendous embarrassment over his emotional display. We agreed that there was clearly more going on than he'd acknowledged, that we both had known that, but we hadn't really found the focus or wherewithal to pursue it, and that now he wanted to get under the surface to get it out. So as part of the new focus, I remotely administered the MCMI4, and it produced the profile that you see in front of you. Now, not surprisingly, the modifying indices told a clear tale of debasing trends, clearly out of proportion with the other validity measures. He held high elevations on both the avoidant and melancholic personality scales, and a secondary elevation on the schizotypal scale. Aligned with that three-step process from the last visual that I showed you, I described aspects of each of the highest elevations for their motivational qualities, without really describing their relationship to one another, though I made somewhat obvious that there was a relationship between the two. I indicated that these two were pretty high, and that in that range that they were in, it was likely that these qualities were pretty omnipresent. Then I mentioned the secondary elevation as kind of a colorization of the first two. So let's look at just these primary personality scales in a bit more detail. Now, step 2 of the three-step process involves referencing the underlying dynamics of each elevated personality scale and how they interrelate across scales. I isolated the avoidant scale, described the active pain dynamic by noting how people who elevate that scale tend to expect a tremendous amount of energy, making sure they're well hidden, even in social situations. That is, they invest in their defenses. They do what they can to remain invulnerable to what they see as a very painful outside world. He remarked that this sounded very familiar, that no one would like the real him. Then I turned attention to the melancholic scale and its passive pain dynamic. I noted that people elevating the scale are just as likely to focus on a cruel and painful perception of the world, but they tend to adjust by giving up defenses and just let whatever happens happen to them. He remarked, so if I waffle between those two, like I refuse to let others see the real me, and other times I just don't care, well, that's awkward. I acknowledged that, then introduced the idea of what a mild elevation on the schizotypal scale might be, not just in terms of outward appearance, but the poorly defined motivational pattern, wavering in defenses and interpersonal intention. And that's when he really surprised me. Now, that keeps people away. But now I really don't have to do that. So what am I supposed to do? There's a change in the affect there. I could see inquisitiveness melt into a mild panic. Seriously, what do I do with that? It was kind of surprising how quickly that affect came into the session. It's fair to say, in terms of those levels of information, a full rundown of existential dread related to what was becoming clear as this person's ability to explain his lack of interpersonal relations was probably level 3 at that point, and very premature to try to go into right then and there. In later sessions, he was able to handle that information as we approached it more gradually and he started to understand it better. But at the time, I opted to continue the immediate assessment by framing the next section on how this might have come to be, rather than what its ultimate effect might end up being. So one layer down, we begin the third step with more specific personologic domains, and then present concerns as represented in the clinical syndromes. I don't have the profile page for the facet scales, but I just wanted to point out what you see here, which also includes domains I identified through looking at the person's bigger context. The shaded circles are the most elevated of the facet scales. The other circles are domain content that became apparent through the clinical interview and cross-checking the table I showed you a short while back. The larger the circle, the more prominent that domain seemed to be, whether as measured by a facet scale or detected in the interview. Here, reds are related to the avoidant construct, blues the melancholic, and greens the schizotypal. In keeping with the notion of respecting levels of information, not wishing to bring out further overwhelm at this time, I acknowledged and validated, but otherwise put aside any emphasis on the rather prominent fatalistic cognitive style, as I felt that was very anxiety-provoking, and not something he'd given a lot of thought to. Instead, I wanted to help him go back and construct a more sympathetic narrative of himself and how he managed his social world under normal circumstances, even though most of us may think of his usual coping styles as not too effective. Most of my emphasis was on the lower right-hand third of this chart, that vexatious content, the alienated self-image, and the depleted architecture. Starting with an acknowledgement of the last of those, and how exhausting and possibly even disorienting it must be, even in normal times, to stay essentially in hiding. I opened up an exploration of what sort of template he had created for understanding his role in the context of others, and how he had difficulties accepting even positive interactions. Getting some history in this area, he gradually laid out how so many interactions, from early family to peer groups, have been remarkably inconsistent, often saying nice things that weren't meant, or gaining a modicum of comfort before rather severe belittlement. Little guidance existed from this early age on how to navigate what we might put in quotes, boy world, where you have to tolerate and participate in teasing in order to enjoy the fruits of those interactions. So he was both teased mercilessly and more subtly generally accepted, and never knew quite how to draw an accurate self-image. So much of his life progressed this way precisely because he became good at holding this tenuous and awkward position, never really allowing for vulnerability by always accepting that this was his lot. In the context of a regular therapeutic progression, I'd want to begin slowly but consistently introducing that fatalism in his cognitive style that was often around but was really amplified by his sibling loss, and his sense that he too was running out of time. However, in a place where he wasn't playing his usual social role of being essentially asocial among a crowd, I didn't want to raise that anxiety. Instead, I continued to focus on reinstating that pre-morbid social role. At a later time, we definitely did begin to address that more acute source of anxiety with the context of how he's traditionally managed himself in this world. But for that immediate moment in the early phases of his work with me, that immediate anxiety experience was pacified to a large degree by finding creative ways to get back into the social games that had not necessarily served him well, but allowed him that sense of normalcy in survival mode. Shedding light then on the conflict of whether and how to activate his interpersonal defenses, and how being an engaged participant in awkward and sometimes alienating social games that at least gave him a modicum of predictability, we were then in a better position to contextualize the clinical symptomology he was experiencing. I'll just point out here that this is a fairly elevated syndromal profile, though not an unusual one. The big elevations are of a double depression, the combination of both major depressive disorder and persistent depression, or dysthymic disorder. Nearly as elevated was the anxiety scale, flavoring this part of the profile with a worrisome quality, as well as a more moderate elevation on the PTSD scale, which in interview was clarified to be understood as a result of chronic patterns of minor interpersonal traumas, but not an identifiable major big T type of trauma. I framed this overall as a worry-colored variant of my metaphor that I often find myself using for double depression. That is, likening it to an average person who gets bronchitis versus someone with asthma who gets bronchitis, and then related that to the depressive qualities of an overall longer-term tendency to interpret the world negatively that then would exacerbate the onset of a major acute depression. So now we want to stabilize. Putting the pieces together, we now have as a scaffolding of sorts, a way in which to contextualize this man's current concerns, and some guidance as how to direct our clinical judgment as to what to focus on and when. How the MCMI-4 prototypal patterns blend together for this man, how he came to understand how much energy he was expending in the conflict over whether and when to shelter against a perceived cruel interpersonal world, largely to no tangible gain, provided that scaffolding of self-understanding as to why he felt so alone, so alienated, and often so awkward and estranged among others in his life. That gave him the interest in looking toward explanations for how he had come to be over the course of his late adolescent and adult life, and then into middle age. He gained the understanding not just that he had difficult experiences with important figures, but also got some guidance into the nature of those difficult experiences, and how it was that so many exchanges, from well-intentioned but misattuned guidance to the common reindeer games of male youth, then shaped his personal uncertainty. In this case, a more accountable, sympathetic narrative of his journey to the present started to help ameliorate the most intense of the major depressive expression, which, while seeking immediate means to reinstate some of his usual defenses, helped him ground himself for what's to come in pursuing ways to integrate currently negative future and existential concerns. So that's one example with the MCMI-4. I'm going to touch briefly now on the MACI-II, the second edition of the Millon Inventory's flagship adolescent instrument that was just released early this year. For those of you working with teens, whether or not you're currently using this or its predecessor, I'd highly recommend catching one of the recorded or upcoming live Mackie II webinars that will be hosted by Robert Tringone, the primary co-author of the instrument. For our purposes here, I'm just going to briefly demonstrate some of the assumptions I've established with MCMI-4 and how the theory and this critical times framework might translate into an instrument built on that same theory and having much of the same structure. This is a Mackie II case profile, and one in which was derived in part from a known historic Mackie, the original Mackie case, not somebody that I saw directly in the current context. So I'm drawing the essence of the presenting issue here and placing it in the current crisis context, just for demonstration purposes. This is one which demonstrates what clearly an internalizing kind of overall profile. There are probably many cases you might think about with teens acting out or finding some ways to draw perhaps much needed attention in the midst of a global pandemic or widespread social unrest. These will be noticed. But what about a compliant teen trying to do what's expected, being helpful, and maybe even being activated to that very help others kind of motivation in these difficult times, who might be experiencing an acute but quiet personal crisis. We don't want this person to fall through the cracks of our awareness. This teen here is a 14-year-old female who is normally quite compliant, attentive to family needs, never hinting at being a problem child, and was found with a small bag of marijuana in her backpack, which she claimed wasn't hers, but that she was coerced into holding for a friend. Upon further pressure, and particularly upon pressure to identify the friend, she admitted that this wasn't true, at least entirely, and that she got it because she heard from others that it gave them a chance to relax and shut out the world. So for purposes of this demonstration, let's assume that she acquired it shortly before the shutdown, and that most of it is still left, as she tried it and didn't know quite what to make of its effects, so she put it aside. With that, let's take a closer look at the elements of this profile and see what information, along with our clinical acumen, might really be critical in this situation. An overall glance of the profile shows a fairly clear 2-point elevation on scale 3, submissive, and scale 7, conforming. A secondary elevation on scale 2, inhibited, is also relevant, and a more subtle but still noticeable elevation exists on scale 9, borderline tendency. Keep in mind that on the Mackie II, as it relates to adolescence, the scales represent emerging personality patterns rather than diagnosable personality constructs. These then are best thought of as more modifiable and adaptive variants of DSM constructs. Submissive is related to the dependent construct, conforming to the compulsive, and inhibited to the avoidant. Borderline tendency is probably more self-evident, but considering its much lower elevation relative to the others, and that it's just over the base rate of 60 to be considered a feature, it's probably best thought of in this profile not as telegraphing imminent borderline personality disorder, but more as an indicator for some growing affective instability, which might possibly be systemic. Finally, in overview, I'd point out that the response negativity indicator shown above the graph as a percentile score is not highly elevated, but it's notable in that this person scored at the 65th percentile for this measure. That reflects a person's tendency to respond to a lot of negatively toned items. Not remarkably so, but an indication nonetheless of not feeling so good about circumstances or life in general. Not entirely inappropriate for the current times. Most of my focus would be on scale 3 and 7. I'd note that both are very passively oriented personality patterns, and typically for both highly deferential to people and establishment, and largely dismissive of their own needs and identity. For the submissive, this likely owes more to something of a self-view as not worthy and not likely to see oneself as very capable. For the conforming, it's to meet the needs that's greater than oneself, but also, as with most compulsive patterns, a level of within-pattern conflict as awareness grows regarding self-needs. While they're likely disavowed, those needs are not being met. Were you to add in the colorization of the inhibited, you'd add a conflictual element of actively seeking to guard against slights, or humiliation, or any one of a number of interpersonal dangers. Finally, scale 9 could indicate an unearthing of emotion. There's quite a lot of fracture and instability here, which I'd guess is somewhat duct taped together by continued good and cooperative behavior, doing what's expected to a fault, and always willing to put aside self-needs for whatever other demands might be emerging. For the facet scales, we see a fairly high overall elevation for both of the two highest prototype scales, as you see in the 3 graphs at the top of the page. The most prominent elements of these two patterns, perhaps not surprisingly, show near uniform elevations on facets that capture passiveness, respectfulness, discipline, and feeling like what you have to offer individually really isn't enough. Two notable exceptions to those top two scales. First, the highest, the submissive elevation, interpersonally docile, speaks to a reticence of need expression and a tendency to not just blend in but virtually disappear in a crowd. Second, I found it fairly striking that in the conforming group, the idea of a conscientious self-image was not highly endorsed like the other elements. The fact that these items are framed not in terms of overt behavior, which is probably very conscientious, but rather how a person sees oneself, speaks volumes. This seems to represent I'm never enough, what I do is never enough. This may also have some representation in the inhibited facet scale of alienated self-image. In the next section of the profile, found toward the bottom, we have a set of clinical syndromes at the bottom, much like the MCMI-4, but geared more to adolescent presentations, as well as the small additional section of expressed concerns that reside around the middle of the profile page, shown here at the top. Starting there, we see two notable elements. We have a moderately high elevation on the identity diffusion scale, indicating a problem for her to really have a very good sense of herself, or her strengths, her goals, her values, her overall identity consistency. That's pretty consonant with what we've described. The other scale I felt was not surprising, was the absolute zero on family discord. Being a sample case and not having the whole history, I can't speak to the family dynamics, and I'd want to know more before drawing conclusions. It'd make a difference if you could characterize them as superficially agreeable, or fully attuned, or more authoritarian, or whatever. But regardless, I'm also always quite suspicious of a zero on this scale, in the original Mackie or here. Perhaps most pertinent, though, to our discussion, recall that in the known case history, the presenting issue was that this adolescent young woman was referred because she was discovered to have marijuana, and not for any other aberrant reason or development. Overlay this with the likelihood that there's pressure, real and or perceived, to take on more than her fair share of responsibility, and imagine what that feels like given her overall profile to help manage the considerably distorted needs that naturally arise from a globally distressing environment. With that in mind, we look at the syndrome section and notice that indeed substance proneness is evident, and not surprisingly anxiety and depression are strongly indicated. But what's unmistakable is the highest elevation, and it hasn't been brought up before. Given the unlikelihood from the profile for this teen to express such delicate needs, it's conceivable that there weren't outward indications of such strong suicidality. Now, knowing this and knowing much more about who this person is, we're in a much better place to contextually address that likely fragility, attuning to her denial of needs, and finding ways in which she can still prioritize her service to others, albeit in a more balanced way, while helping her gradually, in that level 3 information kind of manner, figure out if that service to others orientation is really the most prominent of her core values. So, in brief, we're almost at the end of our hour. I'm going to just go through these bullet points very quickly and turn it over to any questions that might be there. Let's restate a couple of broad takeaways. First, touching on some of the overall considerations of remote or otherwise unusual testing circumstances, particularly in thinking about how we don't know how this might affect the future of assessment. We want to keep our eyes on always doing better, but not getting in our own way by insisting on perfection. We always want to assure test security as per guidelines, and to do so as well as possible to help our assessment environment, administration, and interpretation with our usual protocol. Going beyond the altered procedures, let me just reiterate the major points of using the MCMI4, the Mackie, or many of the instruments in the assessment field from the perspective of highlighting clinical alliance, maximizing a goal of acknowledging, and in some cases realigning a person with their historic sense of normalcy, and then moving on to figure out what has helped them manage in the past, whether that be resilience as we largely think about it, or whether it's a more basic level of day-to-day stability and management. We want to always take into account their level of functioning, current and pre-morbid, inclusive of what the measures are telling us about both of those time points. This helps with their overall goal setting and what direction we might want to take. We want to see about what they've drawn from as strengths, even if it's not what we usually conceptualize as a strength. Sometimes it's necessary to go backward in order to move forward. We want to always, but especially right now, give extra consideration to whether and what information we are going to more immediately present, and build a scaffolding from that which is easier to understand and tolerate to more distal and perhaps less comfortable. That then leads to the last point, which is about most immediately stabilizing that part and helping to ultimately redirect our attention to the possibility for future optimism. So with that in mind, that wraps up the substantive components of the presentation for today. I'm going to turn it now to my Pearson colleagues who have been monitoring your questions and field those in the remaining time.
Well, Dr. Grossman, I think everything was crystal clear given that we have absolutely no questions in our question box. If you have questions that come up later, if you would send them along to us, and we'll certainly answer those for you. But if you want to conclude things for us, Dr. Grossman, and then we will say goodbye.
Okay. I am open to taking questions as was presented before, as was suggested. So please contact your Pearson representatives, and we will do the best we can to clarify anything. Thank you so much for your time and attention today, and wish you all good things as we continue to chart these uncharted waters.
Thank you, Dr. Grossman, for a wonderful presentation, and we do have several upcoming sessions in our Grand Rounds series on November 16th, Trauma and the Value of Assessments, and then on December 7th, Substance Use, A New Normal, and How It Affects Mental Health Care. So you can register at pearsonassessments.com/forward. Again, as we said, any questions, do send them along to us. In the meantime, we thank you for attending, and we look forward to having you join us in the future on some of our other webinars, especially the upcoming webinars in the Grand Rounds series. Thank you very much, everybody.